Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling something a bit different. It's still project management related, of course, but instead of diving into a specific framework or tool, we're going behind the scenes of another podcast, almost like eavesdropping on a conversation.
Oh, I like that. Like we're flies on the wall, listening in on their really juicy bits of their conversation.
Exactly. And the topic they're tackling is Disciplined Agile, or DA as we'll call it for short. And specifically, we're honing in on how DA handles different phases of a project.
Now, I know some folks might think, ugh, project phases sounds dry, but trust me, the way these experts break it down is anything but boring.
Yeah, and that's our goal with these deep dives, right? To distill these complex topics into something that's both insightful and engaging.
Absolutely. No need to wade through hours of jargon-filled podcasts. We'll pull out the golden nuggets for you.
Okay, so these DA gurus, they've got these three phases they use: inception, construction, and transition. Catchy, right? Almost like a Hollywood blockbuster trilogy.
Well, maybe not that exciting. But the concepts are super important. And the first one, Inception, is all about laying the groundwork. What's fascinating here is that it's not about meticulously planning every little detail right from the get-go. It's more about getting everyone on the same page.
So it's less about creating a rigid plan and more about making sure the team is aligned on the overall direction and goals.
Precisely. It's about answering those big picture questions. What are we building? Why are we building it? And what does success look like? Because without that shared understanding, it's like setting off on a road trip without agreeing on the destination.
And I'd imagine just like a good road trip requires checking the map and anticipating potential detours. The inception phase also involves identifying potential risks or roadblocks early on, right?
You got it. Nobody wants to run out of gas in the middle of nowhere. Our experts actually say that this upfront risk assessment is crucial for developing effective mitigation strategies. It's like packing a spare tire in a first aid kit, just in case.
That's a great analogy. So before you even hit the gas, you're thinking about potential hazards and packing those metaphorical tools to handle them.
Exactly. And that way, if and when you encounter those bumps in the road, you're not caught completely off guard.
This is already making me rethink how I approach, well, pretty much everything, not just projects. It's like that saying, expect the best, but prepare for the worst.
Exactly. And this proactive mindset is something our DA experts emphasize throughout their conversation.
This is fascinating stuff, but we're just getting started on our DA journey. We'll be back in the next part of this deep dive to explore the construction phase, where the rubber really meets the road.
I can't wait to unpack that. We'll dive into how DA teams balance flexibility with quality during the actual building process. So buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride.
Thanks for joining us for this first leg of the journey, and be sure to tune in next time as we delve deeper into the world of Disciplined Agile.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork, we've got our destination in mind, and we've packed our metaphorical toolkit for those unexpected detours.
Now it's time to actually hit the road, right? To start building, to move from that initial inception phase into what our DA experts call construction.
You got it. But here's where things get really interesting. Because while traditional project management often feels like following a strict itinerary, DA encourages a much more adaptable and iterative approach.
Okay, so instead of sticking to that rigid plan no matter what, we're allowing for some detours, some scenic routes, maybe even a few U-turns along the way.
Exactly. Because in the real world, projects rarely go exactly according to plan, right? Unexpected obstacles pop up, priorities shift, and new information comes to light.
So how do we balance that need for flexibility with, well, actually getting things done, and not just done, but done well?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's where DA really shines. They've got this concept called test-driven development, and it's all about building in quality checks throughout the entire construction phase.
Okay, test-driven development. I'll admit that sounds a bit intimidating. Can you break it down for us? What does that actually look like in practice?
Absolutely. Imagine you're building a house, right? Instead of waiting until the very end to inspect the foundation, the framing, the electrical, you're constantly checking each component as you go.
So it's like having an inspector on site at all times, making sure each step of the process meets the required standards.
Exactly. You're building a little bit, testing it, refining it, and then moving on to the next bit. And this continuous testing, it's not just about catching errors. It's also about ensuring that what you're building aligns with the overall vision and goals we talked about in the inception phase.
Right, because it's one thing to be adaptable, but you don't want to be so busy adjusting to every little change that you end up miles away from your original
You
destination.
got it. It's like using a compass to make sure that even as you're navigating those twists and turns, you're still ultimately headed in the right direction.
This is making me realize how crucial communication is throughout this entire process, right? Because if
Yeah.
you're constantly testing and adjusting, you need to make sure everyone on the team is aware of those changes and on board with the new direction.
Absolutely. And that's something our DA experts emphasized. They said that communication is key. It's not enough to just have these feedback loops in place.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that information is flowing freely between all team members.
So it's like having regular check-in points along that road trip where
Yep.
everyone gathers around the map, shares their observations, and makes sure they're still on course.
Exactly. And those check-ins, they shouldn't feel like these big formal meetings. They can be quick and informal, just a way to make sure everyone is on the same page.
This has been eye-opening. It sounds like a much more organic and collaborative way to approach projects compared to those traditional top-down methods.
It is. And the experts we're listening to, they argued that this collaborative, iterative approach ultimately leads to better outcomes.
Because you're incorporating feedback throughout the entire process, you're less likely to end up with a final product that misses the mark.
That makes sense. It's like if you're only getting feedback at the very end, it's too late to make any meaningful changes, right?
Yeah.
Precisely. By then, you've already invested so much time and energy, it's much harder to go back and make those course corrections.
So we've talked about setting a clear vision, embracing adaptability, and building in quality checks throughout the construction phase.
Now, imagine you've finally arrived at your destination. You've navigated all those twists and turns, and you've successfully built something amazing. But the journey isn't over yet, is it?
There's still the unpacking, the settling in, the sharing of stories from the road.
Yeah.
What do our DA gurus call that final phase? It's the transition phase, right? It's more than just
Yeah.
crossing the finish line, yeah.
Exactly. Our experts really hammer home that this last stage often gets overlooked, but it's key to make sure everything lands smoothly.
So it's about more than just the accomplishment itself. It's about making that accomplishment useful, shareable even.
You nailed it. Think about it. You've poured your heart and soul into this project, you've overcome challenges, you've learned a ton. But what good is all that if you don't have a plan for sharing it with the world?
So it's like making sure that our metaphorical road trip results in some amazing photos, stories that'll have everyone on the edge of their seats, and maybe even a map for others to follow.
Precisely. In DA terms, the transition phase is all about packaging up all that hard work, all those lessons learned, and making it accessible and valuable to others.
And in a software development context, that might involve things like user guides, training materials, even a launch party to celebrate the new product.
You've got it. Our DA gurus were especially passionate about this idea of user training. They said you can build the most fantastic app imaginable, but if people don't know how to use it, it's worthless.
That reminds me of how frustrating it is to buy a new gadget, only to be completely baffled by the instruction manual. It's like they're written in a different language.
Exactly. DA recognizes that smooth onboarding is crucial for people to actually use and benefit from what you've built.
Fascinating. So the transition phase ensures our product, whatever it may be, is ready for its debut. But even after the launch party, it doesn't just stop there, does it? Feedback still plays a role, right?
You're right on the money. It's like after that road trip, you don't just park the car and never speak of it again.
There's reminiscing, sharing stories, maybe even planning the next adventure. So in the DA world, what's that post-trip phase look like?
This is where things get truly exciting. Our DA experts are huge proponents of continuous learning and improvement. Launching a product isn't the finish line, they say.
More like setting up camp and enjoying the view for a bit.
Perfect analogy. You've conquered this one project, but now you've got a wider perspective. You gather feedback, see what worked well and what could be improved. Maybe even spot a new and more exciting challenge to tackle next.
So it's about staying receptive to feedback even after the product is out there, always looking for ways to make it even better.
Absolutely. And get this, the source material actually argues that this constant feedback loop actually makes teams more efficient over time.
Wait, really? I'd think all that tweaking and refining would slow things down.
It does seem counterintuitive, right? But they gave this example. Imagine a company that only gets feedback once a year on their products. If they release something, and a year later, they hear it's not working quite right. Huge setback.
Ouch, that's a whole year wasted on something they didn't even know was an issue.
Exactly. But the DA approach, with its constant feedback, means they're catching those issues early on, making small adjustments along the way, instead of having to overhaul everything later.
So their product is constantly evolving, getting better and better, all thanks to that feedback loop.
Exactly. It's not about aiming for perfection from day one. It's about constantly iterating, learning, and improving.
This goes way beyond software or project management. This is a philosophy for anything, really. Writing, art, even personal relationships.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what makes this deep dive so insightful. We've journeyed from that initial spark, through the building and adapting, to sharing our creation with the world. And then, importantly, we don't just stop there. We keep that feedback loop alive, always striving to learn and grow.
We've truly scaled the peak of project management wisdom today. Any final words of inspiration for our listeners who are now fired up about incorporating DA into their own work?
Remember, it's not about rigid rules or fancy terms. It's about embracing that spirit of curiosity, adaptability, and never-ending learning. And that's a journey anyone can take.
Beautifully said. A huge thanks to everyone for joining us on this exhilarating deep dive into Disciplined Agile. Until next time, keep those innovative sparks flying.